normality in the city.
So many businesses in the city are attempting to expand and attempting to see their way through this recession, and this type of occasion when many people are returning to work this morning after the holidays is something which we don't need.
The Economy Minister, Richard Needham, said he shared people's anger and fury at the bombings.
I say this to the people of Belfast. Every tile that's being torn off, every window that's knocked out, every building that's being damaged, we will replace each tile, we'll refurbish each building, we'll refit each window, and we will do it better than the buildings were before.
The 500 extra soldiers sent to Northern Ireland before Christmas have gone home, and there are fewer police checkpoints on roads leading into the city centre. Belfast's mayor says current security is ineffective.
The army and the police need to be deployed properly. There needs to be effective counter-terrorism measures taken so that these people are not allowed to hold the people of Northern Ireland to ransom.
One government minister called the bombings the IRA's New Year message of violence and savagery to the people of Northern Ireland.
The government has renewed its attack on Labour's tax and public spending policies. The Prime Minister said tonight that Labour's plans would mean a whopping increase for each and every taxpayer. The Shadow Chancellor, John Smith, dismissed the Conservatives' charges as absolute fantasy. Our political correspondent Steve Richards reports.
The Conservatives' New Year strike against Labour began early this morning, reinforcing a theme which they believe brought them some success when they ran a similar campaign last summer. Their main claim is that Labour's spending commitments imply substantial increases in income tax, even for those on modest incomes. The Chancellor said that Labour would need to increase the basic rate of income tax from 25 pence to 35 pence. And tonight, speaking in Oxford, the Prime Minister pressed home the point.
Over the last 3 or 4 years, whenever there have been difficulties in any of the public services or elsewhere, the Labour Party have said it's lack of resources, it's underfunding. And over that period, they've made a series of promises. Well, we have costed those promises, we have detailed them, and we've set out what they mean in tax terms. And they mean a whopping tax increase, not just for the rich, certainly for them, but a tax increase for each and every taxpayer.
But Labour leaders deny they'll need to finance their spending plans by raising the basic rate of income tax. And they say that only those earning well over £30,000 a year would be affected by the party's proposed top-rate tax band of 50 pence.
What we have said very clearly is that there are certain commitments that we will carry through, and we have spelled them out in terms of increased retirement pensions, increased child benefit, and we do want to spend more on our public services, but the exact amount that we will be able to spend will depend crucially upon the amount of money which comes into the government's coffers through increased economic growth. That's true for all governments.
The Liberal Democrats are alone in not ruling out publicly an increase in the basic rate of income tax.
We're the only party that has honestly and truly said we would be prepared to raise income tax, basic rate, if it was necessary to do so when we came into power, to enable us to have the education and training which we need to make this country a successful trading nation in the future. Labour and the Conservative parties have fudged that issue.
The sort of claims being made today will dominate the election campaign. That's in spite of the fact that both the main parties, less bound by ideology than in the recent past, will want to present themselves as the friend of most income taxpayers while concerned about improved public services.
Tax experts say that Labour's most radical proposal is the change in national insurance contributions, which would be the biggest alteration since the war. They estimate that around 4 million people would pay more in tax and national insurance, but families on average earnings would be better off because of increased child benefit.
It's Labour's public spending plans that are at the heart of the dispute. Despite the government's claims, Labour says it has only two firm spending commitments: higher child benefits and a rise in state pensions, which would give a married couple an extra £8 a week. According to Labour's sums, the measures would cost just under £4 billion, and the money would come from changes to income tax and national insurance. Labour's committed to keeping basic income tax at 25%. It would also keep the 40% rate, which starts to be paid by people earning around £30,000 a year. But Labour says it will introduce a new 50% band on top, for those earning substantially above £30,000. Labour plans changes to national insurance too. The current 9% rate paid by employees would stay the same, but the £20,000 ceiling on contributions would be abolished. Under Labour, that 9% would be paid on all earnings. On the other hand, families with children would have their incomes boosted by higher child benefit. A family with 2 children would get £127 a year more, whatever its income. The impact of all these measures is that families earning up to around £20,000 a year would be better off by the £127 benefit increase. But the losers are higher up the income scale. A family on £30,000 would lose £748 a year, while a family on £50,000 paying Labour's new top rate of tax is likely to be worse off by more than £4,000.
We're probably looking at £5, maybe even £6 billion being raised, and that's certainly enough to pay for the promises on child benefit and state pensions that the Labour Party has produced. But what it does mean is that something in excess of 4 million people are going to find themselves paying more in tax and national insurance contributions than they would under a Conservative government.
But the Conservatives claim taxes would have to go much higher, because Labour's frontbench spokesmen have made other pledges on things like health, education and transport, which according to the Conservatives would increase spending by £35 billion. Labour's response is that such spending would only come when economic growth brings in sufficient tax revenues. But some experts think neither Labour's spending hopes nor Tory tax-cutting plans will come to fruition.
We expect economic growth to be very slow over the next few years in the UK, and therefore I think that the tax-cutting aspirations of the Conservatives and the spending increase aspirations of the Labour Party might well come to not very much at all.
Having put the spotlight on Labour's tax plans, the Chancellor and his advisers will gather this weekend in the country to consider their own budget options. Unusually, they will be meeting against a background where more is now known about Labour's tax plans than about the government's.
The European community has told Russia to get organised after the row over an emergency aid shipment of British beef. Officials in Moscow rejected it because they feared it might be contaminated with BSE, mad cow disease. EC veterinary officials are in Moscow tonight, reassuring the officials that British beef is safe to eat.
In the early hours of this morning, the plane full of British beef finally made its way from Moscow, where the meat on board had been rejected, to Murmansk in the Arctic, where it was gratefully accepted. Indeed, in the end, another city, Ulyanovsk, also tried hard to get hold of the beef that Moscow had turned away.
In fact, this meat became rather popular because there was quite strong competition between these two cities for receiving this meat, and somebody in the end had to decide which it would be.
Ironically, Russian meat is often kept for days in what appear to be insanitary conditions, but some politicians here are defending the behaviour of their bureaucrats and saying there have to be stringent safeguards.
We should be absolutely careful and should be absolutely sure that this humanitarian help will be for good for our children, and the very idea of humanitarian help could not be discredited.
We know that in England many farms have disease of cattle. I think more than several thousand farms.
But in the pathetically stocked meat shops of Moscow today, customers were outraged that British beef had been refused.
In England they eat this beef, so why can't we eat it?
I have no meat at home, so I am angry about it.
It's a disgrace. What kind of government